Hi, I'm Bruce Baker, and this is a lecture in the History of New Orleans series. The title for this lecture is A Different Sort of Territory and State, and it's looking at the nature of Louisiana and New Orleans specifically at the time of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, because, not surprisingly, this was a different sort of place than the 13 British colonies that became the original United States, and also somewhat different from the new territories west of the Appalachians that had been incorporated into the United States and would go on to become other states. The French and Spanish background, and also some differences just in the demographics, the way that slavery and plantation culture had developed, made Louisiana different than other states. At the same time, I think it's possible to exaggerate that too much and to sort of focus on what some scholars call New Orleans exceptionalism, and sort of think that when we study New Orleans, we're studying something that's sort of a novelty, that's different and unusual, but doesn't really tell us much about anything else. I think what we'll find is that while there were significant differences in 1803, and there continue to be differences, and there continue to this day to be differences, in a lot of ways, as the 19th century, and then particularly the 20th century, goes along, New Orleans becomes a city much like many other United States cities, with some distinctions and peculiarities, certainly, but in some ways, every city, of course, has its own separate identity and particular historical trajectory and peculiarities and so forth. So in a way, this larger theme that this lecture today will touch on is this question of New Orleans exceptionalism. And I'm going to break the discussion into three categories. One is demographics, sort of looking at the people who had settled in Louisiana and New Orleans as of 1803. We'll look at slavery and how the Spanish influence on the institution of slavery affected the city. And then finally, we'll consider fairly briefly law. So in terms of demographics, it's important to note that the number of enslaved people is a major factor in the history of the state and also the city. So if we start out with a distinction, the great historian of slavery, Ira Berlin, wrote about the distinction between a society with slaves and a slave society. A society with slaves is a society where the economy, the political structures, the social structures exist, and slavery is sort of added onto that, but it's not necessarily the fundamental structuring principle. However, at a certain point, when there are enough slaves as a proportion of the population, when the labor that enslaved people do is a significant enough part of the economy and so forth, you get a situation that he describes as a slave society, so that the structure of that society simply could not exist in that way if you didn't have slavery. So Louisiana is rather interesting because it sort of goes back and forth between being a slave society and a society with slaves. If we think back to the beginning, there was this very rapid import of enslaved African laborers in the very first few years of the city's settlement, and at that point, it certainly could be considered a slave society. However, as we saw, cultivation of tobacco didn't really take off. The whole plantation complex was a bit slow to get off the ground, and so, in a way, it shifts back to being a society with slaves. However, that begins to change in the latter part of the 18th century, and especially once sugar and sugar planting in southern Louisiana, which is essentially more or less the bits of Louisiana south of New Orleans, and a little bit maybe above New Orleans, but is particularly this far southern bit of Louisiana where the climate is actually suitable for sugar production. So when sugar becomes important in the 1790s, Louisiana shifts again from being a society with slaves to being a slave society. So from 1763 to 1796, between 8 and 9,000 enslaved laborers are imported into New Orleans. Then, between 1803, the date of the Louisiana Purchase, and 1808, the ending of the slave trade in the United States, about 8,000 more slaves arrived. So in that 5-year period, 1803 to 1808, roughly the same number of slaves arrived as in a 33-year period from 1763 to 1796. This gives New Orleans a black majority by 1806. And at the time of the first census in 1810, the first census that happens after the Louisiana Purchase, the city is comprised of 34,311 whites, 34,660 slaves, so there's slightly more enslaved black people than there are whites, and 7,585 free people of color. And it's this last component that's really significant, because this is one of the things that makes New Orleans different from anywhere else in the U.S. That means that roughly 10% of the population of the city is, sorry, not the city, the state, anyway. But roughly 10% of the population are free people of color, and this is a more significant population of free people of color than any other U.S. state. And it's much more like the sugar-producing area of western Cuba. So here again we see a connection where even after Louisiana is part of the United States, and we're perhaps more accustomed now to thinking of it within a North American context, we also are reminded of the connections to the Caribbean and the similarities to other Caribbean slave societies. Another significant feature in the population of New Orleans is immigration from Haiti. There have always been connections since they're both French colonies. And from 1791, when the Haitian Revolution begins, until 1812, about 15,000 immigrants come from Haiti to New Orleans, to Louisiana in general. There's a large surge between 1802 and 1804 when the French General Leclerc is defeated and Haiti effectively establishes its independence. But the largest group, approximately 9,000 people, come in 1809, which is in response to Napoleon's invasion of Spain. Now, you might be asking, why do Haitians move to New Orleans because Napoleon invades Spain? And you can read about that somewhere else, just not in this history thing. Another group that's worth mentioning are the Acadians. So when we think about the French influence on New Orleans, we're mostly thinking about French people who came from France straight to New Orleans, straight to Louisiana, sometimes possibly, again, the Haitian connection. But there's another sort of colonial connection there, and that's from Acadia, which is to say what we also sort of think of as the maritime provinces of Canada: Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and the northern part of what's now the state of Maine. And Britain got those from France in 1713 at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession. Once again, what that is, go look it up. Not really our concern here. The point is that these Acadians had been French subjects. They're now British subjects because Britain has gotten control, and they wouldn't sign a loyalty oath. And that meant that they were always slightly suspect in British eyes. And this wasn't any particular problem until the 7 Years' War comes along. And when that happens, Britain is concerned about having a population that might be, despite the passage of decades, might have allegiances to its enemy France and won't take the loyalty oath and so forth. So starting in 1755, Britain deports these Acadians in an event called Le Grand Dérangement. They deported about 11,500 out of a population of 14,100, so the vast majority of Acadians were deported. And they were dispersed to various parts of Britain's 13 colonies, but some of a later wave of them wind up in Louisiana. Now, in the 1760s, the Spanish governor, because at that point Spain, after the 7 Years' War, has gained control of Louisiana, the Spanish governor, Ulloa, tries to use them to settle a ring of forts as a sort of defensive perimeter around the colony. So there is this population of Acadians who later become called Cajuns, and they are French, but they have a rather different historical experience than the other French settlers. There are also Spanish settlers from various parts of Spain, but a particular group that's worth noting is the Isleños from the Canary Islands. And between 1778 and 1783, about 2,000 of these arrived and settled mostly in St. Bernard Parish. So, as of 1803, the white population was 10 to 12,000. About 50% were French Creole. About 25% were Spanish, which would include Isleños, Catalans, Andalusians, plus Spanish Creoles from the Caribbean and Spanish America. And the rest were a mixture of Americans, Germans, and all sorts of others. So Louisiana comes into the United States in 1803 with a very interestingly diverse population, which is not to say there's not diverse populations elsewhere, like large German presence in Pennsylvania and so on, but it's a different sort of mixture. The black majority is distinctive as well and has a big influence. If we think about what slavery is like, here the key thing is the Spanish influence. And this is because Spain had a rather different attitude towards race and slavery. They had effectively tried to impose sort of standard feudal structures, but local conditions required local adaptations. And the main local condition here was mixed race marriages and mixed race relationships. This creates new racial categories and new rules to sort of manage those. So in Spanish Louisiana, as in other parts of the Spanish Empire, there was an often very complex system of racial categories, depending on the sort of quite precise mixture of white, black, and indigenous background. But these categories, while complex, were also fluid. And so this sets it apart from the English colonies, which tended much more to have what we think of as a one-drop rule. And again, apologies because I am oversimplifying, but I'm trying to sort of get this across fairly quickly. So an idea that you're either white or black, and if you were white, you were all white, and if you had any black ancestry, then you were categorized as black. And that works very, very differently in Louisiana, particularly in New Orleans, and that's largely because of this very complex, kind of bureaucratic Spanish imperial way of approaching things and sort of having lots of categories and lots of processes and so forth. The other thing, of course, is that during the period of slavery, and this is the same right up until the end of slavery in New Orleans, effectively 1862, the sheer number of the free people of color made them a significant factor, and they began to develop their own separate sort of corporate identity based on wealth, on kinship, on militia service, and the fact that Spain made manumission, made freeing enslaved people procedurally and legally easier than had been the case when France was in control, and significantly easier than in the American states, that meant that the number of free people of color kept on increasing. So that's part of why it is as significant as it is in the period that I talked about earlier. When Governor Ulloa arrives, and again, apologies, I'm sure I mispronounced lots of names, but we'll have to get used to that because I'll continue to mispronounce lots of other New Orleans names. But when he arrived, when Spain takes over, he forbid further imports of enslaved people, and that held for a little while, although it did change. But he also outlawed whipping slaves in public, And this was felt to interfere with the slave owner's control. But it sort of indicates, in some ways, a tradition, at least during the Spanish period, of greater state intervention and a greater sense that the state and the government should have control of things, as opposed to the much more hands-off approach that we're accustomed to thinking of with other southern states. The final thing I'll say about slavery that's worth mentioning is, of course, the distinction between slavery in an urban setting and slavery in a rural setting. And to some extent, that's just the story of the difference between cities and the countryside. Cities are busier, there's greater anonymity, there's greater commercial opportunity, there's different social settings, and so forth. So it's not to say that being enslaved was better or worse. It was just different, and it certainly in an urban setting, especially a large city, as New Orleans becomes, it created many more opportunities for more complex social interactions and more diverse social interactions, and in some ways greater mobilities than typically we think of with rural slavery. The final thing to mention is the law, and the key thing here is that the legal system in all of the states of the United States, except for Louisiana, is based on English common law, and this is a system that builds on precedent, that builds on cases that judges had decided previously, and a judge in any given case relies on that as a basis for his or her decision, along with statutes that are passed. Louisiana, though, operates very differently. Its legal system descends out of a Roman precedent and is formulated by Napoleon. Napoleon basically takes the legal system and sort of rewrites everything and sort of categorizes it and formulates it into what's called the Napoleonic Code. And this distinction remains the basis of Louisiana law. And in some ways, it doesn't make a lot of difference, but sometimes it makes quite a bit of difference. When we talk about slavery, there's a rather unusual part of, I suppose you would call it contract law or commercial law, a principle called redhibition, which has to do with the quality and sort of reliability and warranty of something that's sold. So if you sell something that has a defect, then you can't say that, well, the person bought it, so they must have known and they should have known, and buyer beware. That doesn't work that way. This is particularly important for slaves. So if you sell somebody a slave, and it turns out that that slave has a habit of running away, then the buyer, later on, it could be after the person runs away, can come back and say, hey, you sold me a slave, and you knew that they ran away. So rather than saying, well done to the seller for driving a sharp bargain and sort of passing off sort of defective goods in the sense of an enslaved person who's not going to behave and is going to run away and lose a bunch of money for the slave owner, rather than saying, well done to the seller, you made some money there, the seller actually legally under this sort of law has to reimburse the buyer because they've sold them something that's defective. So that's may seem like a small thing, but it actually becomes pretty significant for how slavery works out. The other thing, and this is sort of key to Ari Kelman's book, A River and Its City, which is one of the key readings that I'm suggesting alongside these lectures and other things, is riparian law, that is to say, law relating to rivers. And the key thing here is that the riverfront is available to the public and essentially cannot be privatized. Now, when this runs into the sort of American system of law, we see over the course of 150 years a number of conflicts about this, but a lot of them hinge on this idea of public space and of the banks of the river being available to the public and not really being capable of being privatized. So, those are a few things that make Louisiana different than the other states. and we'll sort of bear those in mind as we go forward through the rest of the 19th century.